This video is sponsored by Squarespace. This is quite possibly the most overpriced and downright challenging camera I have ever bought, but I also think it's one of my favorite cameras of all time. Let me explain. This is the Leica M8, and it was the very first digital rangefinder ever made by Leica. In fact, it was only the second digital rangefinder ever made, being pipped to the post by the Epson RD1, which is also a camera I am desperate to get my hands on at some point. But anyway, this was first released all the way back in 2006, making it around 18 years old now. But despite this, plenty of people are still buying this very outdated piece of technology in 2024 and using it as their main street photography camera. But why? Well, I can't speak for everyone, but from my own personal experience, as I've explained in previous videos like this one up here, the thing I personally love most about photography is the process of actually taking photos. So when I come across a camera that makes me think more considerately about the images that I'm capturing, it's almost certain to spark my interest. And it's that exact reason why I fell in love with my Fujifilm X Pro 2 after years of shooting on Sony cameras, which are technically far superior to this old Fujifilm, but just feel a little bit too clinical in comparison. It's also the reason why I like the idea of taking up film photography again, but as much as I love the end result, getting there is just way too slow, time consuming and expensive for me personally. Now, after saying that, I'm sure there's a bunch of film enthusiasts currently watching this video and shouting at the screen saying something like, "Lol, that guy bought a Leica and then says that film photography is expensive." Typical YouTuber hype bullshit. To which I would respond by saying two things. Firstly, hi dad. And secondly, you absolutely have a valid point, because even for an 18-year-old camera, this thing is very expensive. And we all know that the main reason for the high price is down to it having one of these fancy red dots on the front. But if we can all just look past the brand hype for a second, this camera is still easily one of the most interesting and unique cameras I have ever shot with. And I completely get why these are still so popular. Essentially, this is about as close to the film photography experience as you can get without actually shooting film, not only because of the end results, but mainly because of the shooting and handling experience. Plus, you have all of the convenience of digital photography, most notably unlimited photos, which means there's room to make mistakes and learn from them without being punished financially for it. So if film photography is something that you're currently toying with, then long term, this will eventually work out as the cheaper option, as laughable as that may seem.
He's right, you know.
And because of the Leica brand, there's a very good chance that this purchase will continue to hold its value as time goes on, unlike film, which incurs a higher total cost the longer you keep shooting. But this was never intended to be a film versus digital debate, because both formats are totally valid, and whichever way you slice it, this is certainly a purchase that is not for the faint-hearted. Now, I know that these days, if a photographer talks on YouTube about a camera and says it produces film-like results, that is considered grounds for death by hate comments, because I appreciate that that is a term that is thrown around way too easily, and nothing can truly compare to the unique look of film photography. But the sensor that's inside this camera was actually developed by Kodak themselves, with a lot of people online referring to the colors that this camera captures as digital Kodachrome, named after the iconic film stock. So the photos that it produces certainly do have a very film-like quality to them. Please don't shoot me for saying that. But before we get too carried away talking about image quality, we first need to mention today's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. Now, whether you're a total newbie or a seasoned veteran, every photographer needs a high-quality website to showcase their work. And over the years, I've used a number of services to build various different websites, and in my opinion, Squarespace is definitely one of the easiest to use for complete novices. And that's largely because it offers a huge range of slick-looking templates to choose from, and its simple drag-and-drop interface means that it's never been easier to create a professional looking website in just a matter of minutes. So if you need a website and you want to get started, simply head over to squarespace.com/Tom Calton to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code Tom Calton. And thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Anyway, back to the sensor, and this thing really isn't without its quirks. You may have already spotted this filter on the front of the lens that I've been using. Well, this is an IR cut filter, or infrared cut filter, which, as the name suggests, is used to prevent infrared light from entering the camera. Now, this is here because this sensor happens to be quite vulnerable to infrared light, and this can cause the colors in your photos to look a little bit odd. It tends to give greens a yellowish tint, and darker tones can adopt a burgundy or brownish tint. Now, Leica actually acknowledged this issue at the time of its release and even issued free IR cut filters to anyone who bought the camera, and apparently they'll even honor that scheme today, so long as the serial code of your camera hasn't been claimed against already. Unfortunately, I found out about that information a little bit too too late to see if I could scrounge a free filter from Leica, so I just went ahead and ordered one from AliExpress, which, as it turns out, was a lot more hassle than I anticipated because the lens I've been using has a quite small filter thread of just 37mm, which meant I was limited to what I could get. Luckily, I did find one on AliExpress, as I mentioned, but after waiting around 3 weeks for it to arrive, I found that it was absolutely covered in fungus, so good. So in the end, I just went back to Amazon and I bought a slightly larger 49mm IR cut filter from Hoya, as well as a 37mm to 49mm step-up ring so that it will mount onto this lens. And with this on the front, the IR pollution issue is completely fixed. Though honestly, if you don't want to go through the hassle that I did and the added expense, then you could just easily fix this in post-production if you know your way around Lightroom well enough. Or just don't bother, because actually I kind of like the look it gives, particularly when you convert your images to black and white. And that's because the broader range of light waves captured actually helps to create stunning monochrome imagery with beautiful tonality. Funnily enough, this IR pollution actually has its perks because it makes this a great camera for infrared photography too. Shout out to Justin Phillip, whose video inspired me to give this a go, by the way. Go and check his channel out up here. Now, all I had to do was buy a cheap infrared filter, which is essentially the opposite of this IR cut filter, and it cuts out most of the other light waves except from infrared, allowing you to create these crazy looking images. And this works particularly well when photographing foliage, as it turns them into this candy floss pink color. Or you can easily convert them into monochrome if that's more your thing. Now, a few of the things that make this M8 slightly unusual is that firstly, it's not full frame, unlike all other Leica digital rangefinders which are. This sensor is actually APS-H sized, which is slightly larger than the more common APS-C chips which we use today, but not quite as large as a full frame sensor. And this gives it a crop factor of around 1.33 times, which is certainly something to bear in mind when it comes to picking lenses. It's also the only Leica digital rangefinder to offer a maximum mechanical shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. Every other camera release after this one had its max speed capped to 1/4000th. Now, some people online have suggested that this was down to concerns over the lifespan of the shutter mechanism, but I have no way of verifying that myself. But whatever the reason, this faster shutter certainly helps if you're someone who likes to shoot at wider apertures in bright daylight, mainly because the raw files captured by this thing are not the most forgiving. Although this chip offers 11 stops of dynamic range, don't expect to be able to pull back images from the brink just like you can do with most modern cameras if you dramatically over or underexpose them. In particular, if you overcook the highlights, you really won't have much hope in fixing it afterwards. So getting the exposure right in camera is an absolute must, or at the very least you could just ever so slightly underexpose your shots just to be on the safe side. Now personally, I think this is a good thing as it forces you to get better at controlling exposure quickly in challenging situations. Again, very much like film. But before I get too carried away talking about the end results again, let's talk about the actual shooting experience when using this M8, because its simplicity is actually really refreshing. Let's start with a few positives, and that's the build quality. As you would expect from a Leica, this thing is built like an absolute tank. You could practically bang nails in with it. It's also surprisingly weighty in the hand, but incredibly tactile and nice to hold. Now, because there's no raised grip at the front, a lot of people tend to buy a screw-on grip attachment that goes on the bottom, but I personally think they're very expensive for what they are and look a little bit ugly. So, being as tight as a crab's ass as I am, I opted for this knockoff thumbs-up grip that I bought from AliExpress, which actually does a very good job of giving you more purchase. I also added this soft close shutter button attachment as it helps me to locate the shutter button a little easier when you have the camera up to your eye. Now, when I said that this camera is simplistic, I really did mean it. There is no autofocus, no EVF, no live view, and obviously there's no video capture or IBIS, as this was developed way before the days those features became the norm. This means the number of physical dials and buttons are also very limited. On the top, there's a single dial for shutter speed, a hot shoe port, as I've already mentioned, and also this switch around the shutter button that allows you to select between single shot, continuous shutter, and self-timer. What's the burst rate on this puppy, I hear you ask? Well, it captures shots at a breakneck 1 frame per second. Wow. You may have also spotted this little window on the top here, which basically tells you how many shots are remaining and also the remaining battery life. Now, the former is a little bit redundant these days because the raw files that it produces are just 10 megabytes each. So this 32GB SD card that I'm currently using can capture up to 3200 raw files. So I find that this number on the top rarely goes below 999. Coincidentally, 32GB is also the maximum card size that this camera will accept. As you heard just a moment ago, the shutter sound on this thing is like a barn door slamming. which personally I absolutely love. It just sounds so retro and gives a very satisfying clunk every time you take a photo. I particularly love hearing the whirring sound made by the mechanical shutter as it resets. Though this noisy shutter won't be for everyone, it was actually one of the main criticisms of this camera, but luckily there is a discrete mode that you can activate to help with this. Does this make it quieter? Well, not exactly. It still makes the same level of noise, but the difference is that once you've taken the photo, so long as you keep the shutter depressed, it won't make that loud whirring noise until you release your finger, giving you a little bit more time to run away and avoid drawing attention to yourself. Now, if you happen to be a nervous photographer and you're worried about taking photos of strangers in the street, I found that this is actually a really good way of making people think that you're not actually taking photos of them, but something else. All I do is frame up the shot, take the photo, which makes a small clicking noise, but then keeping my finger depressed, I'll then turn my head and pretend to frame up on something entirely different in the distance and then let go of the shutter. And then the whirring noise makes it seem as if you're photographing something else entirely. Now, as I've mentioned already, there's no live view on this camera, but there is still a screen on the back. And essentially the sole function of this is just to let you navigate a very bare bones settings menu that means most of its life is spent turned off. But seeing as you don't have a large screen and an EVF drawing constant power, the battery life of this camera is pretty insane. I mean, so long as your battery isn't knackered, I've found that even after shooting for a few days with this camera, I've still had plenty of charge, and so far I've only ever charged it once. You can of course use the screen to review your images too, though it's painfully low resolution, so it's almost impossible to check for critical focus. I mainly use it just to check my exposure and composition are okay. Speaking of which, as there's no EVF or live view, composing your shots has to be done using this optical viewfinder. But with this being a rangefinder camera, it isn't like a DSLR viewfinder where you're able to see through the lens of your camera to see exactly what your camera sees. This is basically just a little tunnel that you can look through to help compose your shots and correctly focus. Now, when you look through the viewfinder, you'll notice a few things. Firstly, this little box in the middle is what you use to focus. You simply hover it over the part of your photo that you want sharp, and then adjust the focus ring on your lens until the ghost image lines up with the main picture and they come together to a single point. This is actually where the name rangefinder comes from, because essentially what you're doing is finding the range between your camera and your subject using a simple triangulation system, thanks to the help of a bunch of prisms, mirrors, and a small goblin called Barry who lives in the top of the camera here. Oh, let me out! These lines at the edges help you to compose your shots depending on the lens you have attached. As you can see, when you change the lens, the frame lines will alter according to the focal length that you're using. However, these are limited to just 6 different focal lengths, including 24, 28, 35, 50, 75, and 90 millimeters. If you happen to shoot with a lens outside of these options, you'll either need to do some guesswork or buy an external viewfinder that clips into the hot shoe to correspond with the focal length that you're using. Now, I will admit that the frame lines can take a little bit of getting used to, but I actually really like shooting in this way, as it means that in most cases, even when your eye is up against the camera, you can still see beyond the frame that you're capturing, allowing you to spot things you would otherwise miss, and it just gives you a chance to recompose your shots accordingly. This in particular is perfect for candid types of photography where the scene is constantly changing. Luckily for me, both of the lenses that I've been using with this camera are focal lengths which are supported by the native frameline options, namely this TTArtisan 28mm f5.6 and this Thypoch Eureka 50mm f2. And once you factor in the 1.33 times crop, these equate to a full frame field of view of roughly 37mm and 66mm respectively. Despite being absolutely miniature in size, this TTArtisan lens is surprisingly weighty, mainly because it's machined from solid brass. That not only makes it super hard wearing, but also means that over time this black paint will start to wear away, revealing the brass beneath for a beautiful patina. Now, I know a lot of people will snub this lens immediately because it only has a maximum aperture of f5.6, but for street photography, where I'm mainly shooting in bright daylight conditions and I prefer to use a deeper depth of field to capture more of the scene, this lens is more than capable of doing the job. Plus, it's a hell of a lot cheaper than most of the Leica brand lenses that are out there. Also, waiting in the wings, I have this Thypoch lens, which is actually modeled on the original Taylor Hobson 2-inch f2 lens that was developed somewhere in the 40s, I believe, and this has a really cool collapsible design. Its longer focal length strength and wider maximum aperture of f2 makes it a great accomplice to this 28mm, and I particularly enjoyed using it for taking portraits, which I later converted into black and white images, mainly because I don't currently have an IR cut filter for this lens yet. Now, although this camera can only capture 10 megapixel images, you have to remember that is still around a 4K resolution, so the images it churns out are still plenty large enough for posting online or for making small prints. But you do need to bear in mind that this is an old camera, so the ISO range is fairly limited, ranging from 160 to 2500. And honestly, I wouldn't ever consider pushing it past 640, as everything above this creates a serious amount of digital noise. Now, as I said at the start of this video, this is a pretty expensive camera for what it is at least. So how much did I pay for it exactly? Well, I actually paid a little bit over £1,100 for it, which hilariously is actually a very cheap price, as most of the time they sell for £1,300 to £1,600 here in the UK, or between $2,000 to $3,000 in the US. But the main reason why I got mine a bit cheaper is because I intentionally bought one that was in well-used condition. Why would I do that? Well, honestly, I just didn't want to buy something like this and then never use it because I was constantly worried about it getting damaged. Buying one that's in pre-live condition has removed pretty much all of my worry and allows me just to enjoy using the camera. So, after sinking that much money into this camera, do I actually think it's still worth buying in 2024? Well, it entirely depends on your intentions. If you're just buying it so you can say you own a camera with a red dot on the front, then you'll almost certainly end up with buyer's remorse. Because honestly, who really gives a f about that?
What's your profanity?
What matters most to me is the joy I get from shooting with a camera, whether it's a secondhand point and shoot or an $8,000 Leica. So long as I'm not spending outside of my means and the camera inspires me to get out and take photos, I would personally consider that a worthwhile investment. In the case of this Leica M8, it certainly will not be for everyone. But personally, the fun and challenge it offers me with its simplistic analog style shooting experience, paired with the result of being able to capture beautiful nostalgic looking images, are enough to make this one of my favourite camera purchases to date.